Well, I was looking at my YouTube analytics and I saw that a good amount of my audience is actually from Australia. Now, how that happened, I don't have a clue. But in light of this new revelation, I thought that I would spend just a little bit of time making a short video concerning Christianity in Australia. Now, I've never had the privilege of going to Australia. I've been quite a few places in my life, but I've never been there. That being said, I've been doing a bunch of research on Australia in hopes of asking or answering the all-important question, what does Australia need spiritually? And I came across statistics from Operation World, as well as a few prayer requests through Operation World. And according to this organization, the prayer request that is most needed is that Australia is in need of revival. So how can we pray for revival for Australia, or any nation for that matter? Well, let's answer this by looking at Habakkuk chapter 3. But before we do, of course, a bit of background I think will be helpful here for us. Habakkuk was a prophet to the nation of Judah in the 6th century BC. The Babylonian armies were on the nation's doorstep, and God had revealed to Habakkuk that he himself was sovereignly raising up the Babylonians to discipline his own people, to discipline them for crimes of social injustice and rebellion towards God. And finally, after some dialogue with God himself, Habakkuk recognizes God's right as the judge of all the earth to bring judgment upon his own people in whatever way he deems right. And as Habakkuk reflects upon the painful future that is in store for his people, he decides to pray. And it's not just any prayer. He prays for revival. And I want to ask today, how can we pray for revival? Well, here's the lesson. Pray for revival with an awareness of God's deeds in history. Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 2 says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear? In the midst of the years revive it. In the midst of the years make it known. In wrath remember mercy. Habakkuk, you see, is longing to see the power of God in action as it had been in the past. I've heard of the report of you and your work. In the midst of the years revive it. Notice that very curious phrase that we read twice. In the midst of the years revive it. In the midst of the years make it known. What is being said here? What does this actually mean? You see, Habakkuk is referring to the times in which it appears that God is doing no work at all amongst his own people. A bit like the off-season in Australian football, for example. There are no players that are getting geared up. To the casual fans, at least, there's not a lot that is actually happening. Although there is football taking place on some level behind the scenes, there's no real action that is very visible. Well, during this off-season, this time in which it would seem that God has not been doing much, Habakkuk petitions God to bring revival. He hopes that the one who acted mightily in the past is going to do so in the present. And what we have in verses 3 to 15 is a poem that depicts in very stunning metaphors the way that God's power had been shown in history. So very briefly, let's just look at a few of these verses beginning in verse 3. God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these verses and explain them one by one, but here's essentially the gist of it. Habakkuk prays for revival by talking about what God has done for his people in the past. And the imagery recorded in chapter 3 of his prayer comes largely from the Exodus story. You see, Habakkuk knows from history that Israel is deserving of everything that they're getting. He understands that when God's wrath comes, that nobody stands a chance against it. And he's saying, Lord, all I dare ask you is that even though your people are deserving of what is coming, Lord, in wrath, remember mercy. Now, Habakkuk's not the first one to reflect upon the Exodus and ask for God's help. So often throughout the scriptures, you see the psalmists, you see the prophets, you see King David himself praying to the God of the Exodus. And here Habakkuk, he thinks about God's work in the past and he says, Lord, come and do it again. Revival is not about God doing a new thing, but it's really about God doing an old thing again. And Habakkuk, he teaches us that we can be encouraged. We can be encouraged by how God worked in the past. Some Christians, they ignore the past. All history is history for a reason, right? But we need not concern ourselves with it. Others, though, I think, are living in the past. They refuse to embrace what God is doing in the present. But we aren't to be people who ignore the past, and we aren't to be people who are living in the past, but we are to be people who live in the present and reflect and learn about the past and pray even great prayers of the past. The Lion King's Rafiki, I think, had some pretty wise words here. He said, the past can hurt, but the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. We should learn about the great experiences of God dealing with his people in the past, and we ought to be using that knowledge as fuel for our prayers. So for Christians in Australia, I will join you in prayer and ask God for revival. One preacher in Cambridge said, dare in your prayers to remind God about the great deeds that he's done in the past and ask him to do them again. So I want to join the church in Australia and ask God for revival. I think it is a good thing for us to pray that God would bring something very Exodus-like to Australia. Well, if you've been helped by this video, if you've been blessed by it in any way, I would encourage you to hit the like button because that will push this video out to more and more people that can truly be helped by it. Well, thank you so much, and God bless you in the way.